Hello and welcome back to Live It and Glow audiobooks. We will be picking up where we left off yesterday at Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. This will be the second and final part, as there's not very much left of this book. If you enjoy my audiobooks and the content within them, please subscribe and like. There will be more to come very soon. I will announce the next in the series at the end of this session. If we reach the 1 hour mark, I will be doing a brief intermission. But I'm not really expecting that. I think we can probably get through this pretty quick. Without further ado, here we go. It is a rather risky matter to discuss a happiness that has no need of words. The one thing I am sure can easily be deduced from what I've written is that in order to bring about what I refer to here as happiness, an extreme troublesome set of conditions must first be fulfilled, and an extremely complex set of procedures gone through. The short period, 1 month and a half, of army life that I later experienced yielded many glittering fragments of happiness. But there is one of them, an unforgettable, all-embracing sense of happiness that I experienced at a moment in itself, apparently quite insignificant and quite unmilitary, that I feel compelled to write of here. Although I was in the midst of a group army life, this supreme sense of well-being came upon me, as on every previous occasion in my life when I was quite alone. It happened at dusk on May 25th, a beautiful day in early summer. I was attached to a parachute squad. The day's training was over. I had been for a bath and was on my way back to the dormitory. The late afternoon sky was dyed in shades of blue and pink, and the turf spread below was an even glowing jade. Here and there on either side of the path along which I walked stood the aging, robust wooden buildings, nostalgic souvenirs of an age when this had been the cavalry school. The covered riding paddock, now a gymnasium. The stables, now a post exchange. I was still in my PT clothes, long white cotton training pants, just issued that day, rubber gym shoes, a running shirt. Even the mud that already soiled the bottom of the pants contributed to my sense of well-being. That morning's training and handling a parachute, the extraordinarily rarefied feeling, as for the first time one committed oneself to the empty air, still lingered inside me. A transparent residue, fragile as medicinal wafers. The deep, rapid breathing caused by the circuit training and running that followed had pervaded my whole body with a pleasing lethargy. Rifles, weapons of every kind, were at hand. My shoulder was ready for slinging a gun at any time. I had run to my heart's content over the green grass, felt the sun burning my skin a golden brown beneath the summer sunlight. I had seen 35 feet below me, people's shadows sharply etched and firmly attached to their feet. I had jumped into space from the summit of the silver tower, aware as I went of how the shadow that I myself would cast among them the next instant would lie isolated like a black puddle on the earth, untied to my body. At that moment I was beyond all doubt freed from my shadow, from my self-awareness. My day had been full to the brim of the body in action. There was physical excitement, strength, sweat, and muscle. The green grass of summer was everywhere, A breeze stirred the dust on the path I walked along. The sun's rays slowly slanted ever more obliquely, and in my training pants and gym shoes I walked amidst them quite naturally. Here was the life I had wanted. At that time, I savored the same solitary rough-and-ready joy of the physical training instructor walking back between the old school building and the shrubbery after losing himself in the beauty of the physical training on a summer's evening. I sensed in it an absolute rest for the spirit, a beatification of the flesh. Summer white clouds, the empty blue sky of the following... Summer white clouds, the empty blue sky of the following... the final lesson of the day, and the touch of nostalgic sadness, tinging the glitter of sunlight filtering through the trees, induced a sense of intoxication. I existed. How complex were the procedures necessary to attain this existence? Within it, a large number of concepts that, for me, were close to fetishes, achieved direct association with my body and my senses, quite independently of the agency of words. The army, physical training, summer, clouds, sunset, the green of the summer grasses, the white training suit, sweat, muscle, and just the faintest whiff of death. Nothing was lacking. Every piece of the mosaic was in place. I had absolutely no need of any others, and thus no need of words. The world I was in was made up of conceptual elements that were as pure as angels. All foreign elements had been temporarily swept aside, and I overflowed with the infinite joy of being one with the world. A joy akin to that produced by cold water on the skin, warmed by the summer sun. Quite possibly, what I call happiness may coincide with what other people might call a moment of imminent danger. For that world into which I blended without the medium of words, filling myself thereby with a sense of happiness, was none other than the tragic world. The tragedy, of course, was that moment still unfulfilled. Yet all the seeds of tragedy were within it. Ruin was implicit in it. It lacked entirely any future. Obviously, the basis of my happiness was the joy of having completely acquired the qualifications necessary to dwell with therein. The basis of my pride was the feeling that I had acquired this precious passport, not through words, but through the cultivation of the body, and that alone. This world that was the only place where I could breathe freely. It was so utterly remote from the commonplace and lacking in future. This world I had pursued unceasingly ever since the war had ended, with a burning sense of frustration. But words had played no part in giving it to me. On the contrary, they had spurred me on even farther and farther from it. For even the most destructive verbal expression was but an integral part of the artist's daily task. How ironical it was! At a period when the futureless cup of catastrophe had been brimming over, I had not been giving the qualifications from drinking from it. I had gone away, and when, after long training, I had returned armed with those qualifications in the fullest measure, it was to find the cup drained, its bottom coldly visible, and myself past 40. Unfortunately, moreover, the only liquid that might quench my thirst was that which others had drained before me. Everything was not, as I had deluded myself, recoverable. Time was beyond recall, after all. And yet, as I know, and now realize, the attempt to fly in the face of the relentless march of time was perhaps the most characteristic feature of the way in which, since the war, I had sought to live, by committing every possible heresy. If, as was commonly believed, time was indeed irreversible, was it possible that I should be living here in this way? I had indeed good reason within myself to pose this question. Refusing utterly to recognize the conditions of my own existence, I had set about acquiring a different existence instead, insofar as words, by endorsing my existence, had laid down the conditions for that existence, the steps it was necessary to take to acquire another existence, involving flinging myself bodily on the side of the phantom evoked and radiated by words. It meant changing from a being that created words to one that was created by words. It meant, quite simply, using subtle and elaborate procedures in order to secure the momentary shadow of existence. It was logical, indeed, that I should have succeeded in existing only at one solitary selected moment of my short army life. The basis of my happiness, obviously, lay in my having transformed myself, albeit for only a moment, into a phantom formed by the shadows cast by far-off mouldering words from the past. By now, though, it was not words that endorsed my existence. This type of existence that derived from rejecting the endorsement of existence by words had to be endorsed by something different. That something different was muscle. The sense of existence that produced such an intense happiness disintegrated, of course, a moment later, but the muscles miraculously survived the disintegration. Unfortunately, however, a mere sense of existence is not enough to make one perceive that the muscles have escaped dissolution. One needs to afford proof of one's muscles with one's own eyes, and seeing is the antithesis of existing. The subtle contradiction between self-awareness and existence began to trouble me. I reasoned that if one wants to identify seeing and existing, the nature of the self-awareness should be made as centripetal as possible. If only one can direct the eye of self-awareness so intently towards the interior and the self that self-awareness forgets, the outer form of existence, then one can exist, surely as the eye in Amiel's diary. But this existence is of an odd kind, like a transparent apple whose core is fully visible from the outside, and the only endorsement of such existence lies in words. It's the classical type of existence experienced by the solitary humanistic man of letters. But one can also come across a type of self-awareness that concerns itself exclusively with the form of things. For this type of self-awareness, the antinomy between seeing and existing is decisive. It involves the question of how the core of the apple can be seen through the ordinary red opaque skin, and how the eye that looks at the glossy red apple from the outside can penetrate into the apple and itself become the core. The apple in this case, moreover, must have a perfectly ordinary existence, its color a healthy red. To continue the metaphor, let us picture a single healthy apple. This apple was not called into existence by words, nor is it possible that the core could be completely visible from the outside, like Amiel's peculiar fruit. The inside of the apple is naturally quite invisible. Thus, at the heart of that apple, shut up within the flesh of the fruit, the core lurks in its wan darkness, tremblingly anxious to find some way to reassure itself that it is a perfect apple. The apple certainly exists, but to the core, this existence, as yet, seems inadequate. If words cannot endorse it, then the only way to endorse it is with the eyes. Indeed, for the core, the only sure mode of existence is to exist and to see at the same time. There is only one method of solving this contradiction. It's for a knife to be plunged deep into the apple, so that it is split open and the core is exposed to the light, to the same light, that is, as the surface skin. Yet, then the existence of the apple falls into fragments. The core of the apple sacrifices existence for the sake of seeing. When I realized that the perfect sense of existence is disintegrated the very moment, could only be endorsed by muscle, and not by words, I was already personally enduring the fate that befell the apple. Admittedly, I could see my own muscles in the mirror, yet seeing alone was not enough to bring me into contact with the basic roots of my existence. and an immeasurable distance remained between me and the euphoric sense of pure being. Unless I rapidly closed that distance, there was little hope of bringing that sense of existence to life again. In other words, the self-awareness that I staked on muscles could not be satisfied with the darkness of the pallid flesh pressing about it as an endorsement of its existence, but, like the blind core of the apple, was driven to crave certain proof of its existence so fiercely that it was bound sooner or later to destroy the existence. Oh, the fierce longing simply to see without words. The eye of self-awareness, used as it is to keeping a watch on the invisible self in an essentially centripetal fashion, and via the good office of words, does not place sufficient trust in visible things such as muscles. Inevitably, it addresses the muscles as follows. I admit you do not seem to be an illusion, but if so, I would like to show you how you function in order to live and move. Show me your proper functions and how you fulfill your proper aims. Thus the muscles start working in accordance with the demands of self-awareness. But in order to make the action exist unequivocally, a hypothetical enemy outside the muscles is necessary. And for the hypothetical enemy to make certain of its existence, it must deal a blow to the realm of the senses fierce enough to silence the querulous complaints of self-awareness. That precisely is when the knife of the foe must come cutting into the flesh of the apple, or rather the body. Blood flows, existence is destroyed, and shattered senses give existence, as a whole, its first endorsement, closing the logical gap between seeing and existing. And this is death. In this way, I learned that the momentary, happy sense of existence that I had experienced that summer sunset during my life with the army could finally be endorsed only by death. All these things, of course, had been foreseen. And I knew, too, that the basic conditions for this made-to-order type of existence were none other than the absolute and the tragic. Death began from the time when I set about acquiring an existence other than that of words. For however destructive a garb they might assume, words were deeply bound within my instinct for survival. They were a part of my very life. Was it not essentially when I first felt the desire to live that I began for the first time to use words effectively? It was words that would make me live on until I died a natural death. They were the slow-moving germs of a sickness unto death. I have written above of the affinity between my own illusions and those cherished by the warrior, and of my sympathy for the type of task in which burnishing the sword and burnishing the imagination for death and danger came to the same thing. This was something that made possible through the agency of flesh every metaphor of the spiritual world, and everything, in fact, turned out just as expected. Even so, the impression of enormous wasted effort that hangs about an army in peacetime oppressed me. Admittedly, this was due in large measure to the unfortunate nature of Japan's foundling army that deliberately keeps it far removed from any ideas of tradition or glory. Yet it reminded me of the repeated process of charging a vast battery that's eventually exhausted through normal leakage and has to be recharged. The power it generates is never used for any effective purpose. Everything is devoted to the enormous hypothesis of a coming war. Training plans are drawn up in one fine detail. The troops labor at their tasks. The vacuum in which nothing happens progresses from day to day. Bodies that were in peak condition yesterday have deteriorated ever so slightly today. Old age is progressively cleared away, and youth replenished without intermission. More clearly than ever before, I grasp the true efficacy of words. It is this void in the present progressive tense with which they deal. This void of the progressive that may go on forever, while one waits for an absolute that may never come, is the true canvas on which words are painted. This can happen, moreover, because words, in marking the void, die as irrevocably as the gay colors and designs on Yuzen fabrics are fixed once they are rinsed in the clear waters of Kyoto's river, and in doing so consume the void completely, moment by moment, becoming fixed in each instant where they remain. Words are over as soon as they are spoken, as soon as they are written. Through the accumulation of these endings, through the moment-to-moment rupture of life's senses of continuity, words acquire a certain power. At the very least, they diminish, to some degree, the overwhelming terror of the vast white walls in the waiting room, where we await the arrival of the physician, the Absolute. And in exchange for the way in which, by marking off each moment, they ceaselessly chop up life's sense of continuity, they act in a way that seems to at least translate void into substance of a kind. The power to bring to an end, even though this too may in itself be a fiction, is obviously present in words. The lengthy accounts, written by prisoners in the condemned cell, are a form of magic aimed at ending from moment to moment a long period of waiting that exceeds the limits of human endurance. All we are left with is the freedom to choose which method we will try out when brought face to face with that void in the progressive sense, in the interval while we await the Absolute. Either way, we must make our preparations. That these preparations should be referred to as spiritual development is due to the desire that lurks to a greater or lesser extent in all human beings to fashion themselves, however unsuccessfully, in the image of the Absolute to come. It is perhaps the most natural and decent of all desires. This wish that body and spirit alike should come to resemble the Absolute. Such a design, however, invariably ends in a total failure. For however prolonged and intense the training, the body inevitably progresses little by little towards decay. However much one piles up verbal action, the spirit will not know the end. The spirit, having already lost its sense of continuity of life as a result of the moment-to-moment ends imposed on it by words, can no longer distinguish a true end. It is time that is responsible for this frustration and failure. Yet very occasionally, that same time confers a favor and rescues the project. Here lies the mysterious significance of an early death, which the Greeks envied as a sign of the love of the gods. I, however, had already lost the morning face that belongs to youth alone. A face that, however deep it has sunk in the stagnant depths of fatigue of the previous night, rises fresh and alive to breathe at the surface in the morning. In most people, alas, the unsophisticated habit of exposing the face, quite unconsciously to the dazzling light of the morning, persists to the end. The habit remains, the face changes. Before one realizes it, the true face is ravaged by anxiety and emotion. One does not perceive that it drags last night's fatigue like a heavy chain, nor does one realize the boorishness of exposing such a face to the sun. It is thus that men lose their manliness. The reason that once it has lost the natural brightness of youth, the manly face of the warrior must needs be a false face. It must be manufactured as a matter of policy. The army, I found, made this quite clear. The morning face presented by a commanding officer was a face for people to read things into, a face in which others might immediately find a criterion for the day's action. It was an optimistic face, designed to cover up the individual's private weariness, and no matter what despair he might be plunged into, to encourage others. It was thus a false face, full of energy, spurning and shaking off the bad dreams of the previous night, and it was the only face with which men who lived too long could make obeisance to the morning sun. In this respect, the face of the intellectual whose youth was past horrified me. It was ugly and impolitic. Having concerned myself from the outset of my literary life with methods for concealing rather than revealing myself, I marveled at the function of the uniform in the army. Just as the finest cloak of invisibility for words is muscle, so the finest cloak of invisibility for the body is the uniform. The military uniform, however, is made in such a way that it refuses to suit a scrawny body or a protruding belly. The individuality as pared down by a uniform had, I had found, an extraordinary simplicity and clear-cut quality. In the eyes of others, the man who donned a uniform thereby became, quite simply, a combatant. Whatever his personality and private thoughts, whether he was a dreamer or a nihilist, whether magnanimous or parsimonious, however vast the gulf of sordidness that yawned beneath his uniform, however full he might be of vulgar ambition, he was still quite simply a combatant. Sooner or later the uniform would be pierced by a bullet and stained with blood. In this respect, it matched remarkably well the special quality of muscles, whereby self-endorsement inevitably meant self-destruction. For all that, though, I was in no sense a military man myself. The army is a profession that requires a great deal of technique. As I saw and noted well for myself, it demands more than any other profession a long period of careful training. In order to not lose the techniques once they are acquired, constant and unrelaxing practice is necessary, much as a pianist must practice every day in order to not lose his delicacy of touch. Nothing gives the armed forces so much attraction as the fact that even the most trivial duty is ultimately an emanation of something far loftier and more glorious, and is linked somewhere with the idea of death. The man of letters, on the other hand, must scratch together his own glory from the rubbish within himself, already over-familiar in every detail, and refurbish it for the public eye. Two different voices constantly call to us. One comes from within, the other from without. The one from without is one's daily duty. If the part of the mind that responded to duty corresponded exactly with the voice from within, then one would indeed be supremely happy. On a May afternoon of unseasonably cold drizzle, I was alone in the dormitory, the firing practice that I had been due to witness having been cancelled on the account of the rain. It was chilly there on the plain skirting the foot of Mount Fuji, more like a winter's day than early summer. On such a day, tall buildings where men worked would be aglow with lights even in the daytime, and the women at home would be knitting by artificial light or watching the television, perhaps repenting having put the gas fires away too soon. Ordinary bourgeois life held no force sufficiently compelling to drag out one into the cold, chill drizzle without so much as an umbrella. Unexpectedly, a non-commissioned officer arrived in a jeep to fetch me, The firing practice, he explained, was going ahead despite the rain. The jeep drove steadily along the potholed road, across the plain, lurching violently as it went. Not a soul was in sight on the plain. The jeep climbed a slope, down which the rain washed in sheets, and drove down the other side again. Visibly was restricted, the wind gathered strength, and the clumps of grass bowed before it. From a gap in the hood, the cold rain beat mercilessly on my cheeks. I was glad that they had come from the plain to fetch me on such a day. It was an emergency duty, a voice summoning me lustily from afar. The feeling of hastily leaving a warm lair in response to a voice calling from across the vast rain-blurred plain had a primitive appeal that I had not savored for many a day. On such occasion, something unknown compels me, almost tears me away from the warm fireside. There is no reluctance or hesitation. I gladly go out to meet the messenger from the ends of the earth. In most cases, he has some connection with death or pleasure or instinct. And in the instant of my departure, I abandon everything that is comfortable and familiar. I felt, savored just such a moment long ago in the distant past. In the past, though, the voice that had called me from without had not corresponded precisely to the voice from within. This, I believe, is because I was unable to meet the call from without with my body, managing barely to do so with words instead. I was familiar, it is true, with the sweet pain that occurred when it became entangled in the complex mesh of ideas, but I was ignorant as yet of the deep-rooted joy produced when two types of summons, meeting in the body, finding themselves perfectly matched. Before long, there came the high-pitched whine of the guns, and I caught sight of the bright orange tracer shells being fired, with repeated corrections forever at targets half obscured by the drifting rain. The next hour I spent sitting in the mire, with the rain beating down on me. I recall another memory. I was running alone on one December 14th, on the main track of the National Stadium, beneath the first glimmerings of dawn. In reality, this kind of behavior was no more than a fictional task, a piece of drunken excess, one might well call it. Yet I have never felt so keenly that I was enjoying the ultimate in extravagance, nor have I ever felt so sure that daybreak belonged to me alone. It was a freezing dawn. The National Stadium was a great lily, of which the vast arena, utterly deserted, formed the overblown, speckled, grayish-white petals. I wore only a running shirt and pants. The morning breeze struck chill to the bone. My hands were soon numb. As I passed the gloom in front on the stands on each side, as I passed the gloom in front of the stands on the east side, the cold was daunting. The west side, on which the first rays of the sun were already striking, was more bearable. I had circled the 400-meter track 4 times, and was on my 5th time around. The sun peering over the top of the stands was still intercepted by the edge of the lily's petals, and the magenta of the reluctant dawn still lingered in the sky. The east side of the stadium was touched by the last of the cold night breeze. As I ran, I breathed not only the knife-sharp air, but the lingering aroma of the dawn, the tumult, cries of joy from the stands, the smell of athlete's lotion heightened by the morning chill, pounding of red hearts, fierce resolve. Of such was compounded the fragrance of that great lily, a fragrance that the stadium had retained all through the night, and the brick red of the track was unmistakably the color of the lily's pollen. As I ran, my mind was filled with one idea. the relationship between the voluptuous lily of the dawn and the purity of the body. So completely did this difficult metaphysical problem engross me that I went on running, oblivious to fatigue. It was a problem that somewhere deep down related to myself. It linked up with my boyhood hypocrisy concerning the purity and sanctity of the body, and it had its bearing, I suspected, on the distant martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. The reader is asked to notice that I say nothing of my own everyday life. My intention is to talk only of the several mysteries to which I have been party. Running, too, was a mystery. It immediately placed a non-routine burden on the heart, washing away the emotions of the daily round. Before long my blood would not permit a halt of even a day or two. Something ceaselessly set me to work. My body could no longer tolerate indolence, but began instantly to thirst for violent action, forever urging me on. Thus for many a day I led a life that others might well dismiss as frenzied obsession. From the gymnasium to the fencing school, from the school to the gymnasium, my solace lay, more than anywhere, indeed, lay solely in the small rebirths that occurred immediately after exercise. Ceaseless motion, ceaseless violent deaths, ceaseless escape from the cold objectivity. By now I can no longer live without such mysteries. And needless to say, within each mystery there lay a small imitation of death. All unawares I had embarked on a kind of pitiless round. My age pursued me, murmuring behind my back, "How long will it last?" Yet so firmly was I in the clutches of my healthy vice that to go back to the world of words without the mystery of these rebirths was no longer possible. This does not imply, of course, that after my small rebirth of the soul and the flesh, I went back reluctantly, with a sense of duty, to the world of words. On the contrary, this was the one procedure that ensured that I should return to them joyfully with a glad heart. The demands I made on words became still more strict and exacting. I shunned the latest styles like the plague. Perhaps I was gradually seeking to rediscover the unsullied fortress of words that I had known during the war. It may be that I was trying to reconstruct everything according to the pattern that I had learned before, to find once more my fortress of words, that paradoxical base of freedom outside which I was forever threatened, yet inside which I enjoyed an unparalleled freedom. It was also an attempt to recapture the intoxication I experienced, free from guilt about words. At that age, when I asked words to fulfill only the purest of functions, and that meant trying to recover my own self, as it had been when eaten away by the white ants of words, and to reinforce it with a sturdy body. It was an attempt to restore the state of affairs in which words, however far they might be from the truth, were for me the only source of real happiness and freedom. Much as a child will put a backing of thick, strong paper on a backgammon board that long use has severed at the fold, it meant, in a sense, a return to the poem without pain, a return to my private golden age. Was I ignorant then, when I was 17? I think not. I knew everything. A quarter-century's experience of life, since then, has added nothing to what I knew. The one difference is that at 17 I had no realism. How wonderful it would be, I felt, if I could only go back to the omniscience in which I bathed as agreeably as in cold water in summer. Examining myself in detail, as I was at that age, I found that parts of me that my words had without doubt ended, or extremely few, and that the areas polluted by the radiation of omniscience were very restricted. The reason was that, though I wanted to use words as a memorial, as my bequest to posterity, I got the method wrong. I was cutting down on, even rejecting omniscience, and entrusting to words the whole of my rebellion against the age. I was preoccupied with the task of making words reflect my body, even though I had none, and of sending them winging off towards the future, towards death, bearing my longings like a carrier pigeon, bearing a message in the silver tube attached to its small red leg. Even though one might be justified in describing this process as one designed not to let words come to an end, there was nevertheless a kind of intoxication in it. Earlier I defined the essential function of words as a kind of magic, in which the long void spent waiting for the absolute is progressively consumed by writing, much as embroidery slowly covers the pure white of a long sash. At the same time, I pointed out that the spirit which, chopped into lengthy words, has its natural sense of the continuity of life constantly disrupted, is unable to distinguish a true end, and thus never knows an end at all. If that is so, what function do words have for the spirit when it finally does become aware of the end? An admirable example in miniature of what happens in such a case is to be found in a collection of letters written by young men of the Suicide Squad before setting off on their last mission. That is preserved today at the former naval base of Etajima. Visiting the museum on one late summer's day, I was struck by the remarkable contrast between the majority of letters, which were written in an impressive, orderly style, and the occasional letter rapidly dashed off in pencil. As I stood before the glass cases, reading the last testaments of these young heroes, I felt suddenly that I had resolved a question that had long worried me. At such times, did men use words to tell the truth, or did they try to make of them some memorial? One letter that still remains very vivid in my mind was written in pencil on a piece of rice paper in a youthful, almost careless scribble. If my memory is not mistaken, it was to the following effect, and broke off abruptly in just this fashion. At the moment I am full of life, my whole body overflowing with youth and strength. It seems impossible that I shall be dead in 3 hours' time, and yet... When someone seeks to tell the truth, words always falter in this way. I can almost see him now, fumbling for words, not from shyness, not from fear, for the naked truth inevitably produces this verbal stumbling, but rather as a sign of a certain rough quality about truth itself. The young man in question had no long drawn-out void left in which to await the absolute, nor did he have time to wind things up with words in a leisurely way. As he hurtled towards death, his final everyday phrases seized on a moment when the feeling for life, like chloroform in the strange headiness it produces, had temporarily benumbed his spirit's awareness of the end, and, like a well-loved dog leaping up at its master, came rushing out upon him, only to be dashed rudely aside. The neater letters, on the other hand, with their pithy phrases about duty to one's fatherland, destroying the enemy, eternal right, and the identity of life and death, obviously selected what were considered to be the most impressive, the most noble from among a large number of ready-made concepts, and clearly revealed a determination, by eliminating anything in the way of personal psychology, to identify the self with the splendid words chosen. The slogan-like phrases thus written here, of course, in every sense of words. Of course, in every sense were words. But ready-made though they might have been, they were special words, set at a height loftier than any commonplace action could ever attain. Once there were such words, though, they are lost to us nowadays. They were not simply beautiful phrases, but a constant summons to superhuman behavior. Words that demanded that the individual stake his very life on the attempt to climb to their own lofty heights. Words such as these, in which something first uttered a conscious resolve, gradually comes to demand an inescapable identification, lacked from the outset any bridge that might link them with ordinary, everyday preoccupations. More than any other words, and despite the ambiguity of their sense and content, they were filled with a glory not of this world. Their very impersonality and monumentality demanded the strict elimination of individuality, and spurred the construction of monuments based on personal action. If the concept of the hero is physical, if the concept of the hero is a physical one, then just as Alexander the Great acquired heroic stature by modeling himself on Achilles, the conditions necessary for becoming a hero must be both a ban on originality and a true faithfulness to the classical model. Unlike the word of a genius, the word of a hero must be selected as the most impressive and noble from among ready-made concepts. And at the same time, they more than any other words constitute a splendid language of the flesh. In this way, then, I discovered in that museum the two brave types of words used when the spirit has perceived its end. Compared with these two, the works of my boyhood failed to get to grips with the certainty of death. With ample time to be poisoned by timidity, they were subject in equal measure to the assaults of art. I used words in a totally different way from those beautiful last testaments of the suicide corps. Nevertheless, it seems certain that my spirit, for all the freedom, license even, it permitted to words, and for all the prodigality it permitted the youthful author in his use of them, was still somewhere aware of the end. If one rereads those works now, the signs are plain for all to see. Nowadays I find myself speculating the kind of life in which words first appear, followed by the body already corroded by words, was surely not confined to myself alone. I was surely somewhere guilty of a contradiction in rejecting my own uniqueness, while affirming the uniqueness of my life as such. The unconscious education of my body should have made the contradiction quite plain to me. At that period, then, the end that the body foresaw and the spirit perceived must have been present in the suicide corps, and myself in equal measure. I ought to have been able, even without the body, to take up a stand at some point that left no doubt as to that identity, and among the men who did, even indeed among the suicide corps, there were beyond doubt some who were eaten away by the white ants in the way that I myself was. Those who died, however, were fortunately secure within a fixed identity, an identity established beyond all doubt, the tragic identity. My omniscience at 17 could hardly have been unaware of this. However, what I had begun was the attempt to remove myself as far as possible from omniscience, determined not to use even one of the materials of which the age was built. I mistook obstinate persistence in my own views for purity. What was worse, I mistook my method too, and sought to leave behind a personal monument. How, though, could something personal will ever become a monument. The basic reason for this illusion is only too clear to me today. At that time, I held in contempt a life that could be ended by words. Thus contempt and fear were synonymous in the eyes of the boy that I was then. In all probability, I was afraid of bringing it to an end with words. And yet, imagining that imperishability for words lay in escaping as far as possible from reality, I felt an intoxication in this fruitless action. One might say that there was a happiness, hope even, in the action. And when the war ended, and the spirit promptly ceased to be aware of the coming end, the intoxication also ceased on the spot. What then could be the real meaning of my attempt at this late stage to return to the same point? Was it the freedom I was seeking, or the impossible? Did the two things possibly come to the same thing? What I was after, obviously, was a revival of the intoxication, and this time, in addition to the intoxication, I was conceited enough to believe that my technique in dealing with words was sufficiently practiced for me to choose impersonal words, thereby enhancing their function as a memorial and putting an end to life of my own free will. It would be no exaggeration to say was the only revenge I could take on the spirit for stubbornly refusing to perceive the end. I was loath to take the same course as others who, when the body is turning its steps towards the future decay, refuse to follow it, but silently tag along after the far blinder and more stubborn spirit until they are completely deceived by it. Somehow or other, I must make my spirit conscious once more of the end. Everything started from there, only there. It was clear. Could I find a basis for true freedom? No, wait. Somehow or other, I must make my spirit conscious once more of the end. Everything started from there. Only there, it was clear, could I find a basis for true freedom. I must soak myself once more in the cold water of my boyhood omniscience, fresh as a cold bath in summer. The omniscience that the misapplication of words had made me deliberately avoid. But this time I must give expression to everything, including the water itself. That such a return was impossible was obvious without my being told. Yet the impossibility stimulated my mind in its boredom, and the mind, which could no longer be aroused to action save by the impossible, was beginning to have dreams of its freedom. I had already seen in the paradox enacted by the body the ultimate form of the freedom that comes through literature, the freedom that comes through words. Be that as it may, that which had eluded me was not death. It was tragedy that I had once let slip. More accurately, what had eluded me was the tragedy of the group, or tragedy as a member of the group. If I had achieved identity with the group, participation in tragedy would have been far easier, but from the outset, words had worked to drive me farther and farther from the group. Moreover, feeling as I did that I lacked the physical ability to blend with the group, and that I was therefore constantly rejected by it, I desired somehow to justify myself. It was this desire that led me to polish words so assiduously, with the natural result that the kind of words I dealt in constantly rejected the significance of the group. Or should I say that the rain of words that fell so steadily within me during the period when my existence was barely adumbrated, like a rain that begins falling before the break of dawn, was in itself a forecast of my inability to adapt to the group. The first thing I did in life was to build up a self, amidst the rain. The intuition of my infancy, the intuitive sense that the group represented the principle of the flesh, was correct. To this day I've never once felt the need to amend it, but it was only in later years when I first came to know that what I have called the dawn of the flesh, that rosy vertigo that descends on one after grueling use of the body and intense fatigue, that I began to perceive the significance of the group. The group was concerned with all those things that could never emerge from words, sweat and tears and cries of joy or pain. If one probed deeper still, it was concerned with the blood that words could never cause to flow. The reason, perhaps, why the testaments of the doomed are oddly remote from individual expression, impressing one rather with their stereotyped quality, is that they are the words of the flesh. At the moment when I first realized that the use of strength and the ensuing fatigue, the sweat and the blood, could reveal to my eyes that sacred, ever-swaying blue sky that the shrine bearers gazed on together, and could confer the glorious sense of being the same as others, I already had a foresight, perhaps, of that as yet distant day, when I should step beyond the realm of individuality into which I had been driven by words, and awaken to the meaning of the group. There is, of course, such a thing as the language of the group, but it is in no sense a self-sufficient language, a speech, a slogan, and the words of a play all depend on the physical presence of the public speaker, the campaigner, the actor. Whether it is written down on paper or shouted aloud, the language of the group resolves itself ultimately into physical expression. It is not a language for transmitting private messages from the solitude of one closed room to the solitude of another distant closed room. The group is a concept of uncommunicable shared suffering, a concept that ultimately rejects the agency of words. For shared suffering, more than anything else, is the ultimate opponent of verbal expression. Not even the mightiest Weltschmerz in the heart of the solitary writer, billowing upwards to the starry heavens like some great circus tent, can create a community of shared suffering. For though verbal expression may convey pleasure or grief, it cannot convey shared pain. Though pleasure may be readily fired by ideas, only bodies, placed under the same circumstances, can experience a common suffering. Only through the group, I realized, through sharing the suffering of the group, could the body reach the height of existence that the individual alone could never attain. And for the body to reach that level at which the divine might be glimpsed, a dissolution of the individuality was necessary. The tragic quality of the group was also necessary. The quality that constantly raised the group out of the abandon and torpor into which it was prone to lapse, leading it on to the ever-mounting shared suffering, and so to death, which was the ultimate suffering. The group must be open to death, which meant, of course, that it must be a community of warriors. In the dim light of the early morning, I was running, one of a group. A cotton towel with the symbol of a red sun on it was tied about my forehead, and I was stripped to the waist in the freezing air. Through the common suffering, the shared cries of encouragement, the shared pace, and the chorus of voices, I felt the slow emergence, like the sweat that gradually beaded my skin, of that tragic quality that is the affirmation of identity. It was a flame of the flesh, flickering up faintly beneath the biting breeze, a flame, one might almost say, of nobility. The sense of surrendering one's body to a cause gave new life to the muscles. We were united in seeking death and glory. It was not merely my personal quest. The pounding of the heart communicated itself to the group. We shared the same swift pulse. Self-awareness by now was as remote as the distant rumor of the town. I belonged to them. They belonged to me. The two formed an unmistakable us. To belong? What more intense form of existence could there be? Our small circle of oneness was a means to a vision of that vast, dimly gleaming circle of oneness, and all the while foreseeing that this imitation of tragedy was, in the same way as my own narrow happiness, condemned to vanish with the wind, to resolve itself into nothing more than muscles that simply existed. I had a vision where something that, if I were alone, would have resolved back into muscles and words, was held fast by the power of the group, and led me away to a far land, whence there would be no return. It was perhaps the beginning of my placing reliance on others, a reliance that was mutual, and each of us, by committing himself to this immeasurable power, belonged to the whole. In this way, the group for me had come to repent. In this way, the group for me had come to represent a bridge that, once crossed, left no means of return. This ends the main portion of Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. I will take a short 5-minute break, and we will continue with the epilogue and ending poem. We return to Yukio Mishima's Sun and Steel. We have finished the main body of the work. Now all that is left is the epilogue and the final poem at the end. So this is Epilogue F-104 from Sun and Steel. Epilogue F-104. Before my eyes, there slowly emerged a giant snake, coiled about the earth. A snake that by constantly swallowing its own tail, vanquished all polarities. The ultimate huge snake that mocks all opposites. Opposites, carried to extremes, come to resemble each other. And things that are farthest removed from each other, by increasing the distance between them, become close together. This is the secret that the circle of the snake expounded. The flesh and the spirit, the sensual and the intellectual, the outside and the inside, will remove themselves a pace from the earth and high up, higher even than where the snake ring of white clouds encircling the earth is joined. They too will be joined. I am one who has always been interested only in the edges of the body and the spirit, the outlying regions of the body and the outlying regions of the spirit. The depths hold no interest for me. I leave them to others, for they are shallow, commonplace. What is there, then, at the outermost edge? Nothing, perhaps, save a few ribbons dangling down into the void. On earth, man is weighed down by gravity, his body encased in heavy muscles. He sweats, he runs, he strikes. Even with difficulty he leaps. At times, nevertheless, I've unmistakably seen, amidst the darkness of fatigue, the first tinges of color that herald what I have called the dawn of the flesh. On earth, man wears himself out in intellectual adventures, as though seeking to take wing and fly to infinity. Motionless before his desk, he edges his way closer, even closer, to the borders of the spirit, in constant mortal danger of plunging into the void. At such times, though very rarely, the spirit too has its glimpses of the dawn light. But body and spirit had never blended. They had never come to resemble each other. Never had I discovered in physical action anything resembling the chilling, terrifying satisfaction afforded by intellectual adventure. Nor had I ever experienced an intellectual adventure, the selfless heat, the hot darkness of physical action. Somewhere, the two must be connected. Where, though? Somewhere, there must be a realm between. A realm akin to that ultimate realm where motion becomes rest, and rest motion. Suppose I flay about me with my arms. As I do so, I lose a certain amount of intellectual blood. Suppose I allow myself, however briefly, to think before I strike. At that moment, my blow is doomed to failure. Somewhere, I told myself, there must be a higher principle that manages to bring the two together and reconcile them. That principle, it occurred to me, was death. And yet, my idea of death was too mystical. I was forgetting the plain, physical aspect of death. The earth is surrounded by death. The upper regions, where there is no air, are crowded with death, pure and unalloyed. It gazes down on humanity, going about its business, far below and bound by its physical conditions on earth. Yet very seldom does it bring bodily death to man, since those same physical conditions prevent him from climbing this far. For man to encounter the universe as he is, with uncovered countenance, is death. In order to encounter the universe and still live, he must wear a mask, an oxygen mask. If one took the body to those same rarefied heights with which the spirit and intellect are already so familiar, the only thing waiting for it there might well be death. When the spirit and intellect ascend to such heights, alone, death does not reveal itself clearly. The spirit, therefore, is always obliged, reluctantly, and with a feeling of dissatisfaction, to return to its fleshly dwelling on earth. When it ascends alone, the unifying principle refuses to show itself. Unless body and spirit come together, the principle will have nothing to do with them. At that stage, I had not encountered that giant snake. Yet, how familiar my intellectual adventures had made me with the loftiest regions of the sky. My spirit flew higher than any bird, unafraid of my lack of oxygen. Possibly even, it had no need, in the first place, of anything so rich as oxygen. How I laughed at them, those grasshoppers who could jump no higher than their bodies would take them. The mere sight of them, far below me in the grass, would make me hold my sides and shake with mirth. Yet, I had something to learn, even from the grasshoppers. I began to regret that I had never taken my body with me into the upper regions, but had always left it behind on earth, in its ponderous casing of muscle. One day I dragged my body with me into a pressure chamber. 15 minutes of denitrification. The breathing in, that is, of pure oxygen. My body was overwhelmingly astonished to find itself placed in the same pressure chamber that my spirit entered every night, to find itself bound immobile to a chair, forced to submit to operations it had never imagined possible. Never had it dreamed that its role would be reduced simply to sitting without moving hand or foot. For the spirit, this was routine training in withstanding high altitudes, and presented no difficulties at all, but for the body the experience was unprecedented. At each breath, the oxygen mask clung to the nostrils, then detached itself again. "Look here, body," said the spirit. "Today you're going with me, without budging an inch, to the highest limits of the spirit." "You're wrong," countered the body contemptuously. "So long as I go with you, then however high they may be, they're the limits of the body too. You only say that, you with your bookish knowledge, because you have never taken the body with you before." But all such talk aside, we set off together, without moving from the spot. Already, the air was being sucked out through the small hole in the ceiling. An invisible lowering of the pressure was slowly beginning. The motionless cabin was ascending towards the heavens, 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet. Though, to the eye, nothing was happening inside the cabin. That same cabin, at a frightening pace, was shaking off its earthly chains. As the oxygen thinned out within their cabin, so everything that was familiar and ordinary began to recede. At around 30,000 feet, some shadow seemed to be approaching, and my breathing became the gasping of a dying fish, frantically opening and shutting its mouth on the surface of the water. Yet still my nails showed no sign of the purple of cyanosis. Could the oxygen mask be working properly? Glancing at the flow window of the regulator, I could see the white indicator moving slowly in a broad sweep at each large, deep breath I took. The oxygen supply was coming through. But suffocation was taking place as the gases dissolved in the body were turning to bubbles. So precise had been the resemblance between the present physical adventure and intellectual adventure that so far I had not been alarmed. I had never supposed that anything definite could happen to my motionless body. 40,000 feet. A sense of suffocation increased still further. Hand in amicable hand with my body, my spirit was searching frantically for any air that might be left. Any air it found, even the smallest amount, it would have devoured it greedily. My spirit had known panic before now. It had known apprehension, but it had never known this lack of an essential element that the body normally supplied to it without being asked. If I held my breath and tried to think, my brain was immediately occupied, frantically occupied with the creation of the physical conditions for thought. And in the end it breathed again. Though, in the manner of one committing a necessary error. 41,000 feet, 42,000 feet, 43. I could feel death stuck fast to my lips. Soft, warm, octopus-like death. A vision of dark death, like some soft-bodied animal, such as my spirit had never even dreamed of. My brain had not forgotten that training would never kill me. Yet this inorganic sport gave me a glimpse of the type of death that crowded about the earth outside. And then, a sudden freefall, the experience of hypoxia produced by removing one's oxygen mask during the horizontal flight at 25,000 feet, and the experience of a sudden drop in pressure when, with a brief roaring sound, the interior of the cabin was suddenly enveloped in a white mist. Finally, I passed my test, and was given a small pink card certifying that I'd undergone physiological flight training. Soon, then, I should have the chance to find out in what way the edge of my spirit and the edge of my body would meet and fuse together in a single shoreline. The 5th of December was a glorious fine. The 5th of December was gloriously fine. At the base I could see the silver, gleaming forms of the F-104 supersonic fighter squadron lined up on the airfield. Maintenance men were attending 2016, in which I was to be taken aloft. It was the first time I had seen the F-104 so peacefully at rest. Often, with longing eyes, I had watched it in flight, acute-angled, swift as a god. The F-104 was no sooner seen than it had ripped through the blue sky and vanished. I had long dreamed of the moment when that speck in the sky would enfold my own existence with it. What a mode of existence it was! What glorious self-indulgence! Could there be any more glittering insult to the stubbornly sedentary spirit? How splendidly it ripped through the vast blue curtain, swift as a dagger stroke. Who would not be that sharp knife of the heavens? I donned the dun-colored flying suit and fastened on my parachute. I was taught how to release my survival kit and had my oxygen mask tested. The heavy white helmet would be mine for a while, and silver spurs were fastened to the heels of my boots to prevent my legs from springing up and breaking. It was past 2 o'clock on the airfield now, and sunlight was falling and scattering from between the clouds like water from a sprinkler truck. Clouds and light together were disposed according to the familiar convention observed in depicting the sky over battle scenes in old paintings. From some heavenly coffer behind the clouds, solemn shafts of light pierced through the fanned out towards the earth. Why the heavens should have formed such a vast, awe-inspiring, old-fashioned composition, why the light should have been filled with such inner weightiness, bringing a touch of divinity to distant woods and hamlets, I do not know. They seemed to be saying a mass for the soon-to-be-pierced sky. I got into the rear of a two-seater fighter, fastened the spurs on the heels of my boots, chucked my oxygen mask, and was covered with the hemispherical windshield glass. My dialogue with the pilot was interrupted frequently by directions in English. Beneath my knees rested the yellow ring of the ejection equipment, its pin already out. Altimeters, speedometers, instruments innumerable. The control stick that the pilot was testing was duplicated in front of me, and the second stick vibrated furiously between my knees as he tested this. 228. Engine started. At intervals through the metallic thundering, I could hear, on a cosmic scale, the pilot's breathing within his mask, heaving like a typhoon. 230. Gently, 016 entered the runway and stopped for a test with throttles fully open. I was filled with happiness. The joy of setting off for a world that was completely controlled by such things was something utterly different from the departure of an airliner, which serves merely to transport bourgeois existence from one place to another. For me, it was a farewell to the everyday and the earthly. Oh, how I had longed for this, how intensely I had looked forward to this moment. Behind me lay nothing but the familiar. Before me lay the unknown. The present moment was the thinnest of razor blades between the two states. How impatiently had I awaited the fulfillment of this moment. How I had yearned for it, to come under conditions as strict and unalloyed as possible. It was for this, surely, that I was alive. How could I fail to feel affection for those whose kindness had made it possible? For many years I had forgotten the word departure, forgotten it as a magician might try deliberately to forget a fatal spell. The takeoff of the F-104 would be decisive. The upper regions at 10,000 meters, that the old Zero fighters reached in 15 minutes, would be reached in a mere 2 minutes. Plus G would rest hard upon my body. Soon my vitals would be pressed down by an iron hand, my blood flow as heavy as gold dust. The alchemy of my body would begin. Erect-angled, the F-104, a sharp silver phallus, pointed into the sky. Solitary, spermatozoan-like. I was installed within. Soon, I should know how the spermatozoan felt at the instant of ejaculation. The furthermost, the outermost, the most peripheral sensations of the times in which we live are bound up with the G, that is, the inevitable concomitant of spaceflight. Almost certainly, the remotest extremities of everyday sensation in our age blend with G. We live in an age where the ultimate, in what was once referred to as the psyche, resolves itself into G. All love and hate that does not anticipate G somewhere in the distance is invalid. G is the physical compelling force of the divine, and yet it is an intoxication that lies at the opposite extreme from intoxication, an intellectual limit that lies at the opposite extreme from the outer limit of the intellect. The F-104 took off. Its nose lifted, and lifted further, almost before I realized we were piercing the nearest clouds. 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet. The needles of the altimeter and the speedometer spun like small dancing white mice. Mach 0.9, almost the speed of sound. Finally, G came. But it came so gently that it was pleasant rather than painful. For a moment my chest was empty, as though a cascade of water descended with a great rush and left nothing behind it. My field of vision was monopolized by the sky, blue with a grayish tinge. I felt as though we were taking a great bite of the sky, chewing it and gulping it down. My mind stayed as fresh as ever, Everything was quiet, majestic, and the surface of the blue sky was flecked with the seamen white of clouds. Since I was not asleep, to say I awoke would be wrong. Rather, I experienced an awakening, as though another layer had been torn rudely off my wakefulness, leaving my spirit pure, unsullied as yet by my contact. In the unsparing light of the windshield glass, I clenched my teeth against naked joy. My lips, I'm sure, were drawn back as though in pain. I was one with the F-104 that I had seen before in the sky. I transformed my being into this thing that I had seen before my eyes. To men on Earth, who until a moment ago had numbered me amongst them, I had become a receding existence. I dwelt at a point that was now no more than a fleeting memory for them. Nothing could be more natural than to imagine the notion of glory derived from the sun's rays that poured so mercilessly through the glass bubble of the cockpit from this utterly naked light. Glory was surely a name given to just such light. Inorganic, superhuman, naked, full of perilous cosmic rays. 30,000 feet, 35,000 feet. A sea of clouds spread out far below, devoid of any conspicuous irregularities. Like a garden of pure white moss, the F-104 headed far out to sea to avoid sending shockwaves to Earth, racing south as it approached the speed of sound. 2:43 p.m. From 35,000 feet and a supersonic speed of Mach 0.9, we climbed with a slight vibration through the speed of sound to Mach 1.15, Mach 1.2, and so to match 1.3, Mach 1.3, at a height of 45,000 feet. Nothing happened. The silver fuselage floated in the naked light, the plane maintaining a splendid equilibrium. Once more, it became a closed, motionless room. The plane was not moving at all. It had become simply an oddly shaped metal cabin, floating quite still in the upper atmosphere. No wonder, then, that the pressurized chamber on Earth could serve as an exact model of a spaceship. The motionless thing becomes a precise archetype of the most swiftly moving thing. There was even no suffocation sensation. My mind was at ease, my thought process lively. Both the closed room and the open room, two interiors so diametrically opposed, could serve equally, I found, as dwellings for the spirit of one and the same human being. If this stillness was the ultimate end of action, of movement, then the sky about me, the clouds far below, the sea gleaming between the clouds, even the setting sun, might well be events, things within myself. At this distance from the earth, intellectual adventure and physical adventure could join hands without the slightest difficulty. This was the point that I had always been striving towards. This silver tube floating in the sky was, as it were, my brain, and its immobility the mode of my spirit. The brain was no longer protected by unyielding bone, but had become permeable, like a sponge floating on water. The inner world and the outer world had invaded each other, had become completely interchangeable. This simple realm of cloud, sea, and setting sun was a majestic panorama, such as I had never seen before, of my own inner world. At the same time, every event that occurred within me had slipped the fetters of my mind and emotion, becoming great letters freely inscribed across the heavens. It was then that I saw the snake, that huge, but the adjective is hopelessly inadequate. Snake of white cloud encircling the globe, biding its own tail, going on and on forever. Anything that comes into our minds, even for the briefest of moments, exists. Even though it may not exist at this actual moment, it has existed somewhere in the past, or it will exist at some time in the future. Here lies the resemblance between the pressure chamber and the spaceship. The resemblance between my midnight study and the interior of the F-104, 45,000 feet up in the sky. The flesh should glow with a pervading prescience of the spirit. The spirit should glow with the overflowing prescience of the body. And my consciousness, that shone serene like duralumin, watched over them all the while. The black shoulders of Fuji loomed in a silhouette slightly to the height of the plane's nose, gathering their clouds in slovenly fashion about them. To the left, the island of Oshima. The white smoke from its crater curdled above it like yogurt, lay in a sea that gleamed in the setting sun. Already, we were below 28,000 feet. If the giant snake ring that resolves all polarities came into my brain, then it is natural to suppose that it was already in existence. The snake sought eternally to swallow its own tail. It was a ring vaster than death, more fragrant than that faint scent of mortality that I had caught in a compression chamber. Beyond doubt, it was the principle of oneness that gazed down at us from the shining heavens. The voice of the pilot fell on my ears. We're going to lower our altitude and make for Mount Fuji. We'll circle the crater and do a few rolls and lazy eights. Then we'll make for home, passing over Lake Chuzaneji on the way. Red lilies. Reflections from the surface of the sea, dyed crimson by the sunset, glowed through rents in the sea of clouds directly below. The crimson cast a glow within the thick layer of vapor, staining it with color, dotting it all over with red flowers. That concludes the epilogue. Now the closing poem, titled Icarus. Do I, then, belong to the heavens? Why, if not so, should the heavens fix me thus with their ceaseless blue stare, luring me on, and my mind higher, ever higher, up in the sky, drawing me ceaselessly up, to heights far, far above the human? Why, when balance has been strictly studied, and flight calculated with the best of reason, till no aberrant element should by rights remain, why still should the lust for ascension seem in itself so close to madness? Nothing is that can satisfy me. Earthly novelty is too soon dulled. I am drawn higher and higher, more unstable, closer and closer to the sun's effulgence. Why do they burn me, these rays of reason? Why do these rays of reason destroy me? Villages below and meandering streams grow tolerable as our distance grows. Why do they plead, approve, lure me, with promise that I may love the human? If only it is seen thus from afar. Although the goal could never have been love, nor, had it been, could I ever have belonged to the heavens. I've not envied the bird its freedom, nor have I longed for the ease of nature, driven by naught save this strange yearning, for the higher and the closer, to plunge myself into the deep sky's blue, so contrary to all organic joys, so far, from pleasures of superiority, but higher and higher, dazzled, perhaps, by dizzy incandescence of waxen wings. Or do I, then, belong, after all, to the earth? Why, if not so, should the earth show such a swiftiness to encompass my fall? Granting no space to think or feel, why did the soft, indolent earth thus greet me with a shock of steel plate? Did the soft earth thus turn to steel only to show me my own softness, that nature might bring home to me that to fall, not to fly, is in the order of things? More natural by far than that imponderable passion is the blue of the sky than a dream. Was it devised by the earth to which I belonged, on account of the fleeting white-hot intoxication achieved for a moment by waxen wings? And did the heavens abet the plan to punish me for not believing in myself, or for believing too much, too eager to know where lay my allegiance, or vainly assuming that already I knew all, for wanting to fly off to the unknown, or the known, both of them a single blue speck of idea? And this concludes Sun and Steel. Thank you for listening. My next project will be excerpts from the Hannes Wessel and Andre Schaefer's book, The SAS in Rhodesia, We Dared to Win. I will probably begin this next Thursday, most likely. And if anybody makes it this far, please give me feedback on whether the live stream format or the pre-recorded edited format is the better way to go, because I do not really know at this point which is better. Pre-recording and editing takes a lot of time. Live streaming is very quick, and I can get a lot out of the way in a short amount of time. Editing pre-recorded material takes roughly about 4 to 5 hours. Live streaming takes roughly about 2 hours. But I don't mind sacrificing quality for quantity. But I would like some input from somebody to let me know which is more worthwhile to do, which is more enjoyable to listen to. But anyways, with that, I will end this stream and this reading. I hope you have enjoyed it. Please subscribe, please like, comment. I enjoy having conversations with people on this channel occasionally. It's a slow-going process getting this all off the ground, but this is going to be roughly the format. Either I will live stream or upload the audiobook readings for now. Come next year, I hope to put out more substantial content that includes more than just this. So stick around in anticipation for that, and in anticipation for other readings. Alrighty, as always, I am Livid, Anglo, Alpha on some platforms. Check out my telegrams, which are in the link, and follow my Instagram. And